He had everything money could buy, until her husband's secret destroyed it all. A riveting tale of wealth, betrayal, and a woman's fight to rebuild. The morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Winnetka estate like melted honey, gilding the marble foyer and catching the crystal pendants of the chandelier that hung overhead like a frozen waterfall. Eleanor Whitmore stood at the base of the curved staircase, one hand resting on the mahogany banister, and allowed herself, just for a moment, to feel the full weight of everything she had. She was 37 years old. Her reflection in the polished marble floor beneath her bare feet was that of a woman who had never known a single day of genuine hardship. Her cashmere robe, the color of dove gray, had cost more than most American families' monthly rent. Her hair, dark and lustrous, fell past her shoulders in loose waves that had been permed and pampered by the most exclusive salon on the North Shore. Her skin, maintained by a dermatologist who flew in quarterly from New York, had a luminous, poreless quality of a woman who had never smoked, never stayed up late, never done anything to accelerate the entropy that takes all of us eventually. She looked, as she always did, like a painting come to life, something from a Gagosian gallery, all elegance and studied composure, the accumulated product of 37 years of being told that she was beautiful and that her beauty was her most valuable asset. But something was wrong. Something had been wrong for months now, and today, standing in the house she had shared with Daniel Harrington for 12 years, she could feel it in her bones, a vibration, like a cell tower shifting on its foundation, threatening to bring down everything it held. It was not a specific premonition. It was worse than that. It was the absence of something she couldn't name, a quiet subtraction in the air, like the moment before a note changes pitch and you know the music is about to become something else. She heard his footsteps above her. The master bedroom door opened and then closed again. The guest room. He had been sleeping in the guest room for 11 weeks now. 11 weeks of lying in their bed alone, her side cold, his side untouched, listening to the house settle around her like an organism that had stopped trying to comfort her. 11 weeks of the particular silence that fills a marriage when the people in it have run out of things to say to each other but haven't yet found the courage to say the one thing that matters. Eleanor Whitmore, born Eleanor Cavendish, daughter of Gerald and Catherine Cavendish, whose private equity firm had once been the 9th largest in the Midwest, had been raised on the principle that a woman's worth was measured in the quality of what surrounded her. Not her intelligence, not her resilience, not her capacity for kindness or courage or any of those old-fashioned virtues her mother had rolled her eyes at over canapes at the economic club. Her surroundings. The right address. The right school. The right husband. The right handbag at the right lunch table. Everything external, everything displayable, everything that could be photographed and archived and referenced as evidence of a life well curated. And she had checked every box. Every single one. She had been the valedictorian of her class at New Trier, not because she cared about academics, but because her mother had made it clear that failure was not an option in any visible arena. She had attended Northwestern because it was expected, had majored in art history because it was easy and because her mother had said, with a particular tone she reserved for suggestions that were actually commands, that a young woman with her social advantages had no need of a practical degree. She had spent her 20s being aggressively social, building a network of connections and obligations that had the appearance of friendship but lacked its substance. And then Daniel Harrington had swept her off her feet at a charity gala in the Gulf Coast 12 years ago, and everything, every calculation, every expectation, every careful plan her mother had constructed, had been vindicated in a single evening. He was 31, devastatingly handsome in a way that was almost architectural, all sharp jawline and warm brown eyes and a smile that made women forget how to breathe. His family owned Harrington Communications, a cable and broadband empire that stretched across 3 states, and Daniel had been positioned to inherit the whole thing, the golden son of a golden family, a man whose bloodline was so thoroughly blue-chip that he could have done almost anything with his life and chosen instead to do the most expected thing of all. He had noticed Eleanor the moment she walked into the ballroom at the Drake Hotel, and she had felt it, the electric, unmistakable current that runs between two people who know, with absolute certainty, that they are meant for each other. It was the most romantic thing that had ever happened to her. It was also, she would eventually understand, the most calculated. Their courtship lasted 8 months. 8 months of flowers delivered to her apartment on Walton Street, of dinner reservations at the most exclusive restaurants in the city, of Daniel remembering the names of her favorite flowers and her mother's birthday and the precise shade of blue that looked best against her eyes. He was attentive in a way that felt almost aggressive, as if he were trying to prove something to her, to himself, to the social world that was watching. He brought her pearls. He sent her books. He called when she least expected it, just to say he was thinking about her, and she allowed herself to believe that this was love. Their wedding at the Peninsula Chicago was the social event of the season. 340 guests. A dress by a couturier whose waitlist was 2 years long. A string quartet playing Valdi while Eleanor walked down the aisle on her father's arm. Her veil, which had belonged to her grandmother, a severe matriarch whose portrait hung in the Cavendish family compound, with the same high cheekbones and cool blue eyes Eleanor saw in the mirror every morning. She remembered, with the kind of clarity that only trauma can unlock, the exact moment she looked into Daniel's eyes as she reached the altar and believed, truly, purely, with every fiber of her being, that she would be happy forever. The organ was playing. The light was streaming through the stained glass. Her father kissed her cheek and transferred her hand to Daniel's, and the weight of it, his hand, warm and dry and certain, felt like a key turning in a lock. She was home. She had arrived. The fairy tale was real, and she was living it, and nothing would ever go wrong again. What a beautiful, tragic, foolish girl she had been. The first 5 years of marriage were, by any objective measure, a fairy tale. They bought the Winnetka estate, 11,000 square feet, 6 bedrooms, a pool shaped like something from a luxury resort, a 4-car garage with his and hers vintage porches, and filled it with art, furniture, and the kind of curated beauty that announces, without saying a word, that the people who live here do not worry about money. The living room alone contained a sofa that cost more than a Honda Civic and a painting above the fireplace that was an actual Liechtenstein, one of a limited series, purchased at auction with a paddle held by an art consultant whose commission alone would have funded a year of college for most people. The kitchen had marble countertops from Carrara, Italy. The wine cellar held bottles that Daniel had begun collecting before they met, a collection that represented not just money but taste. Eleanor decorated. She was good at it. She had an eye for beauty that bordered on compulsion, and the house became a showcase. Architectural Digest had come out twice to photograph it. On the second time, the photographer had spent 4 hours getting the light right in the library, where the afternoon sun came through the east-facing windows at precisely the angle that made the spines of the books glow like embers. She volunteered for 6 charity boards, the Art Institute, the Lyric Opera, the Field Museum, the Museum of Contemporary Art, and the Chicago History Museum, and shared the Alliance for Arts Education, which her mother had founded. She hosted elaborate dinner parties where Chicago's elite praised her salmon en croûte and her effortless, luminous poise, and Eleanor performed the role of hostess with such precision that she sometimes forgot, in the middle of her own dinner party, that she was performing at all. Daniel was devoted. Genuinely, intensely devoted, in the way that wealthy men can afford to be devoted when their devotion costs them nothing and everything simultaneously, when it is expressed in gestures rather than sacrifice, in presence rather than presence of mind, in the daily accumulation of small attentions that create the appearance of intimacy without requiring its substance. He came home every evening by 7, without fail, even when the office was hectic. He brought her flowers, not roses, which he said were predictable, but peonies, gardenias, occasionally white lilies that made the house smell like heaven for 3 days and like death for the 4th. He remembered every anniversary, every birthday, every small victory in her day with a thoughtfulness that made her feel seen in a way her own parents never had. Her father saw her as a reflection of his own success. Her mother saw her as raw material for further social construction. Daniel, at least in those early years, seemed to see her as a person, a complete, separate, genuinely interesting person whose thoughts and feelings matter to him in and of themselves. "You are the only thing in my life that is real," he told her on their 5th anniversary, aboard a yacht sailing Lake Michigan at sunset. "Everything else is just business. You're the only thing that matters." She believed him. God help her, she believed every word, with the desperate hunger of a woman raised to want the storybook ending, the golden husband, the life that looked like a Pinterest board come to life. The truth, the terrible, boring, predictable truth, is that no marriage is ever one thing. It is a living organism, shifting and breathing and adapting, and the health of it depends on 1,000 small, invisible acts of attention that most people are too tired, too distracted, or too selfish to perform. Somewhere around year 6, the balance began to tip. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would have triggered an alarm. It was subtle, so subtle that Eleanor, who had never been trained to notice anything that didn't announce itself loudly, almost missed it entirely. Daniel started working later. Not later enough to be suspicious, just later enough to be noticeable. 9 o'clock became 10. 10 became 11. He started traveling more, to the company's regional offices in Milwaukee and Indianapolis, and occasionally a place in Ohio that he mentioned once and then never again. Trips that seemed to multiply like cells dividing in a petri dish, each one a little longer, a little more frequent, a little more difficult to schedule around. He stopped suggesting they take trips together. He stopped mentioning, in passing, things he wanted to show her or places he wanted to take her. The world of his desires, which had once seemed to include her at its center, contracted until she could no longer see its boundaries. But Eleanor had been raised to be a wife, not a detective. She didn't press. She trusted, because trust was what she had been taught to offer in return for the fine things she had been taught to expect. She filled her days with the kind of purposeful emptiness that wealthy women specialize in. Yoga at 6. A meeting of the Art Institute's patron circle at 10 where they discussed acquisitions in tones of reverent exclusivity. Lunch at Trey Roddy with her friend Margot, who was going through a divorce and needed company, which Eleanor provided with the patient, half-attentive kindness of someone who had never experienced real suffering and therefore had no framework for recognizing its early stages in someone else's life. She did not notice, or chose not to notice, that the passion between her and Daniel had been cooling for some time. The dinners alone. The weekends he suddenly had to work. The way his hand lingered on her shoulder for a beat too long before dropping away, as if the contact itself had become a kind of obligation rather than a desire. She told herself that this was normal. That marriages settled into comfortable rhythms. That what they had was deep and durable and had nothing to do with the mechanics of desire, which she had been raised to understand was an uncivilized force better channeled into home decoration and strategic philanthropy. She was wrong, and she would not understand exactly how wrong she was until the night that shattered everything. It started, as these things do, with money. Harrington Communications had been riding the broadband boom for a decade, but the landscape was shifting beneath them with the slow, inexorable force of geological change. New competitors were emerging, tech companies with leaner operations and aggressive pricing strategies that targeted the same suburban markets Harrington had dominated for years, offering packages that made Harrington's pricing look like the desperate overreach of a monopoly that had forgotten how to compete. Revenue began to plateau. Then it began to drop. Quarter after quarter, the numbers soured, and the board of directors, which had always treated Daniel like a golden prince on a throne they had built for him, began to look at him with something uncomfortably close to scrutiny, the way you look at a performer who has stopped being entertaining but whose contract hasn't expired yet. He came home one evening in October. The trees on Sheridan Road were ablaze with color, orange and red and gold, the most beautiful time of year in Chicago, when the city briefly transforms itself into something that looks like a painting and then loses all its leaves overnight, and sat Eleanor down at the kitchen island. The house was silent. The staff had gone home. The only sound was the tick of the sub-zero refrigerator and the muffled hiss of the radiant heating system beneath the limestone floors, a sound she had heard 10,000 times and never noticed until this moment. when the silence around it had become so loud she could hear nothing else. "We have a problem," he said, and his voice had a quality she had never heard before, a kind of flattened effect, as if the words themselves were exhausted, as if he had rehearsed them so many times in his own head that they had lost all their original weight. "The board wants to restructure. They're talking about selling to a larger conglomerate. If that happens, I lose my position. If I lose my position, we lose the income we've been living on." And Eleanor, he paused, pressed his fingers to his temples, a gesture she had never seen him make, as if the crown of his head hurt in a way he didn't know how to describe. "The margin is tighter than anyone knows. We've been living on the line for 18 months. She stared at him. The words arrived in her brain but refused to arrange themselves into meaning. It was like watching someone speak a foreign language. She recognized the sounds but not the content, the tone but not the message. 18 months. They had been bleeding for 18 months, and she had been redecorating the library and hosting holiday parties and buying new cocktail dresses, and she had not known. She had not known because no one had told her, because Daniel had protected her from it the way wealthy men protect the women they love from everything except the consequences of their own blindness. "What are you saying?" she asked carefully. "I'm saying that we need to make changes. Significant changes. The house, the cars, we may need to consider selling some of our assets." Eleanor felt the floor tilt beneath her, a vertiginous sensation that had nothing to do with the wine she had consumed at lunch with Margot. She gripped the edge of the counter. "Sell the house? It's on the table." She thought of the house. The curved staircase that she had selected, personally, from a design firm in New York. The library with its floor-to-ceiling shelf and the window seat where she read on Sunday mornings with a cashmere throw over her legs. The particular quality of light in that room at that hour. The feeling of being enclosed in something beautiful and safe. The garden, which she had designed herself with a landscape architect from Libertyville, English cottage garden, roses and foxglove and nepeta, a stone path that wound through it like a secret, a place she had imagined walking with children she had never had, a future she had allowed herself to believe in. She thought of the neighborhood, the other estates, the anonymity of wealth that surrounded them and made them both feel simultaneously special and ordinary. She thought of the dinner parties, the gallery openings, the society pages that had chronicled their life with the same matter-of-fact enthusiasm with which they chronicled the lives of all the other golden couples who moved through Chicago's social season like figures in a dance whose step because feeling was not something Catherine Cavendish had taught her to do in public. "We are not selling this house." Daniel looked at her, and something in his expression shifted, a flicker of something that might have been disappointment, or frustration, or the quiet recognition of a distance between them that had been growing for longer than either of them wanted to admit. He looked at her the way you look at someone who has just revealed, inadvertently, that they are living in a story you have already finished telling. "We may not have a choice, Eleanor." "Then find another choice." He didn't push back. He just nodded slowly, pushed his bar stool back from the island, and walked out to the terrace. She watched him through the glass door, his silhouette against the October dusk, a cigarette glowing between his fingers. He had quit smoking 8 years ago. She hadn't seen him smoke since their second year of marriage, when he had quit cold turkey after a doctor told him his blood pressure was elevated. She stood at the window and watched the smoke curl up into the darkening air and felt, for the first time, that she was looking at a stranger. That was the moment Eleanor would later realize that everything began to fracture. Not dramatically, not all at once. But the first crack had appeared, thin as a hairline in fine china, and it would spread, slowly, methodically, with the patience of time, until the whole surface shattered. She tried to adapt. She really did. She read books about financial planning and pretended to understand them. She started paying attention to the household accounts, which she had previously delegated entirely to a bookkeeper whose reports she signed without reading. She began asking Daniel questions, careful, non-accusatory questions about the business, about the board, about what options they had, and found that the more she asked, the less he wanted to talk, until the subject became a wall between them that neither of them acknowledged but both of them navigated around. The changes came in waves. First, Daniel let go of the housekeeper who had been with them for 8 years, a kind, round-faced woman named Luz who had practically raised Eleanor's non-existent children. They had never had children, a fact that Eleanor had made peace with long ago, or thought she had, until moments like these when the silence of the house pressed in on her like a physical weight, a reminder of choices she had made or failed to make or perhaps had never been given a genuine opportunity to make. Then he sold the vintage Porsches. Her 356 entered 911, the two cars that had been parked side by side in the climate-controlled garage like matching pieces of jewelry, and replaced them with a single Tesla, charcoal gray, the kind of car that announces environmental consciousness in the same breath as it announces wealth, a compromise that satisfied no one. The art consultant was dismissed. The wine club membership was disbanded. The twice-yearly cleaning of the chandeliers, which had been done by a specialist who drove down from Milwaukee with his own equipment, was cancelled. Eleanor watched these amputations happen with the frozen, dissociative calm of a woman observing her own body being prepared for surgery. She did not cry. She did not protest. She signed the papers and made the calls and smiled at the people who came to assess the value of her possessions, the Liechtenstein, the furniture, the silverware that had been wedding gifts from people whose names she could barely remember, with the same plastic composure she had perfected at her mother's side at charity auctions, where the goal was to make everyone feel comfortable while extracting the maximum amount of money for the minimum amount of genuine connection. But something was happening to Daniel that she could not control. The financial pressure was changing him, not in the ways she might have expected, not with the visible signs of stress that movies had taught her to recognize. He didn't rage. He didn't withdraw in the conventional sense. He did something worse, he disappeared. Not physically, he was still in the house, still at the dinner table, still in the bed that had become a no man's land between two strangers, but somewhere deep inside him, behind his eyes, in the tamper of his laugh when he managed to laugh at all, the well of him had gone dry. He was like a building whose occupants have moved out but whose facade remains, a shell that looks inhabited until you notice that no lights come on in the evening and the mail accumulates by the door. He stops telling her she was beautiful. He stopped touching her, not just the intimate touches, which had been infrequent enough that their absence might have been easy to rationalize, but the casual one, the brush of fingers on his shoulder as he passed, the small of the back as he leaned past her to reach something, the way a married couple inhabits each other's space with the unthinking physical intimacy of two people who have shared a bed for more than a decade. He started going out, not to the office, which was a different beast now, a hungry and unpredictable creature that consumed him during daylight hours with meetings and calls and the particular frantic energy of a company trying to outrun its own decline, but to places she didn't know about, at hours she didn't track. He came home at 2, 3 in the morning, smelling of other women's perfume and top-shelf whiskey and something else, something electric and alive and utterly alien to the man she had married, something that suggested a version of Daniel Harrington that she had never met and did not recognize. She noticed. Of course she noticed. But she was Eleanor Cavendish, raised to maintain appearances above all else, and so she said nothing. She told herself it was stress. She told herself it was a midlife crisis. She believed almost none of it, but believing was easier than acting. The first time she found evidence, hard, irrefutable evidence, was a Wednesday night in February, one of those brutal Chicago winter nights when the wind screams off Lake Michigan. She had gone upstairs to find his phone for a prescription number, and his phone was on the nightstand in the guest room, his room now, for 3 months, and the screen lit up with a message from a contact saved as a single initial, J. She should not have read it. She knew it with the same certainty that told her gravity worked. But she was a woman who had been losing control of her life for months, and the part of her that had been compressed and ignored rose up like a fist and opened the message. It was a photograph. And then another. And then a third. And then Eleanor Whitmore was sitting on the edge of her husband's guest bed at 11:43 on a Wednesday night, her hands shaking so violently that she nearly dropped the phone, staring at images that rewrote the story of her entire life. The woman in the photographs was young, early 20s, maybe, with bleached blonde hair and a smile that suggested she charged by the hour, which she did, which Eleanor would learn in the days and weeks and months to come, though learning it would never stop feeling like swallowing glass. And she was doing things with Daniel Harrington that made Eleanor's cheeks burn and her stomach turn and something inside her chest collapse like a building that had finally met its wrecking ball after surviving everything else. She read the messages. They were cheerful, practiced, transactional, the language of an economy Eleanor had never known existed, had never wanted to know existed. The whole architecture of an affair conducted like a business meeting with appointments and fees and the particular shorthand of people who have reduced intimacy to a service industry. She saw the arrangements being made, times, places, fees. She saw the pet names, baby and darling and other words that once meant something and now meant nothing, the currency of counterfeit emotion. She saw, in the accumulated evidence of months of texts, the portrait of a husband she did not recognize engaging in a life she could not have imagined. The phone rang in her hand. Daniel. He must have seen the notification on his watch, the little icon that told him she had opened the message, the timestamp that told him exactly when. She answered it, and her voice, when it came out, was steady in a way that surprised her. Eleanor. His voice was careful, controlled. The voice of a man who already knows what is about to happen, who has been waiting for it, who perhaps has even, in some sick and terrible way, wanted it, wanted to be caught, to have the secret dragged into the light, to transfer the weight of it from his shoulders to the space between them where it could finally, catastrophically, be named. Are you with a prostitute? The words came out flat, almost conversational, which was the only way she could get them out at all. The only way they would fit through the throat that had closed around them like a fist. Silence. 3 seconds of silence that lasted 3 years. I can explain. Are you with a prostitute, Daniel? Another silence. Then, I'm coming home. Don't bother. She hung up. She sat there for a moment longer, the phone still clutched in her hand, the screen still lit with the evidence of his betrayal. And then she stood up and walked to the bathroom, where she was sick, really, genuinely, violently sick. And then she looked at herself in the mirror, at the mascara running in black rivers down her cheeks, at the woman she had been for 12 years of marriage, and she said, out loud, to the empty room, this is not who I am. This is not the end of who I am. She meant it. She did not feel it. But she meant it, and in the days to come, when the feeling would catch up to the meaning, that meaning would matter. Daniel came home at 12:15. She heard his key in the lock, the heavy oak door that she had personally selected from a reclamation yard in Vermont, choosing it for the particular quality of its grain, the way the wood seemed to hold light within itself. She was sitting in the living room, on the sofa she had bought for its line and its leather and its aggressive, uncompromising modernity, the kind of furniture that makes a statement about the person who chose it. She was holding a glass of water because she had read somewhere that remaining hydrated helped manage shock, and she was not crying. The tears had dried up somewhere between the bathroom and the living room, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity that felt like being dipped in ice water, shocking, painful, but clarifying in a way that nothing else had been in months. He came in. He looked terrible, rumpled, red-eyed, the golden boy unraveled, his collar askew and his hair disordered in a way she had never seen, as if he had been running his hands through it compulsively, as if he had been sweating through the conversation he knew was coming. He stood in the doorway and looked at her, and for a moment neither of them spoke, and the silence between them was so heavy that it pressed against the walls like a living thing. How long? She said. He sat down in the armchair across from her. He didn't reach for her hand. He didn't try to explain or justify or apologize, not yet, as if he understood that the first thing owed was not defense but truth. He just sat there, with the weariness of a man who had been carrying something too heavy for too long, and said, 8 months. Give or take. 8 months. The house had already been bleeding by then. She had been redecorating and volunteering and lunching with Margot while her husband was paying some stranger to pretend to love him, to perform the intimacy that he should have been receiving at home, from her, if he had wanted it, if he had ever truly wanted it at all. Who is she? She's nobody. It's not Eleanor, it's not what you think. It's not romantic. It's not even personal. It's just, he paused, searched for the word, as if the truth were a language he had forgotten how to speak. Escape. It's just escape. Escape from what? From this. He gestured vaguely at the room, at her, at the accumulated weight of everything they had built together and everything it was costing him to maintain. From the pressure. From the failure. From feeling like I'm drowning and everyone's watching and no one is, he stopped. His eyes were wet, and she saw in them something she had not expected to see, genuine anguish, the kind that is not performed for effect but emerges from a depth that cannot be faked. You don't understand what it's been like. The board, the finances, the way they look at me. I'm the Harrington heir who is single-handedly destroying the Harrington legacy. Do you have any idea what that feels like? To be the man who loses everything your family spent 3 generations building? Eleanor set her glass of water down on the marble coffee table with a precise, controlled click, the sound of something ending. I have some idea, she said. I married you. The words hung between them. Daniel flinched, a visible flinch, as if she had struck him. Good, she thought. Good. And then she felt ashamed for thinking it, and then she felt angry at feeling ashamed, and then she felt nothing at all, which was the most frightening thing of all. She left the living room. She walked past the dining room with its table that seated 12 and its understanding that the dinner parties were over, at least for now. She went upstairs and locked the door of the master bedroom, her bedroom now, entirely hers, the one with the window seat and the garden view and the memory of 1,000 mornings when she had woken up next to the man she loved and believed, with every cell in her body, that the world was a fair and generous place that rewarded people who did things correctly. She sat in the window seat and watched the snow fall on the garden she had designed, the roses she had planted with such care, the foxglove that had established itself with the confident arrogance of a plant that knows it belongs, the nepeta that spilled over the stone borders like a living thing that refused to be contained, and she thought about every choice that had led her to this room, this night, this woman she barely recognized in the mirror of her own reflection. She thought about her mother, Catherine Cavendish, who had taught her that a woman's appearance was her most valuable currency, that a well-maintained facade was a form of intelligence, that the women who were beautiful and married well were the winners of a competition most people didn't even know they were playing. She thought about her father, Gerald, who had taught her that love was a performance, that marriage was a merger of assets and social capital, that emotion was an indulgence that had no place in a well-run life, and that the feelings you couldn't control were weaknesses to be managed rather than truths to be followed. She thought about the gala where she had met Daniel, the way the string quartet had been playing something by Handel, the way the candles had caught the gold in his eyes and made them look like they contained something precious, something worth having. She thought about the word devoted. How many years had she confused that word with devoted? How many years had she mistaken comfort for passion, proximity for intimacy, the quiet satisfaction of being well provided for the earthquake of real love? How long had she been living in a house that looked like a home and was actually a museum of her own delusions? She didn't have answers. She had only the snow, the dark, and the terrible, magnificent awareness that her life, the life she had been so certain was the correct life, the life she had been promised by every story she had been told and every example she had been shown, had just ended. Not in the way that marriages end, with a legal document and a division of assets, but in the way that a dream ends when you wake up, suddenly, completely, and with the lingering disorientation of someone who has lost their grip on what was real. She was 37 years old. She was married to a man who paid strangers for intimacy. She was living in a house that represented everything she had been taught to want and nothing that she had ever actually chosen. And for the first time in her adult life, she had no idea what to do next. The weeks that followed were the most brutal of Eleanor's existence, and she had been raised in a hothouse, a carefully controlled environment where temperature and humidity and light were calibrated to produce a specific result, a beautiful, delicate flower that could not survive in the world for which it had been bred. She had no tools for this. No framework. No precedent. She had been trained since birth to maintain facades, to smile through difficulty, to present a composed and beautiful surface to the world regardless of what churned beneath it. But she had never been trained to process genuine catastrophe, because genuine catastrophe was not supposed to happen to women like her. Women like her were protected. Women like me were insured against risk, hedged against loss, positioned above the reaches of ordinary misfortune. And yet here she was, in the middle of an ordinary misfortune that felt like anything but. Daniel moved out. Not to the guest room, out, completely, definitively, with a suitcase and a promise that he would find somewhere to stay and a lawyer who would handle the rest. He rented a townhouse in Lincoln Park, minimalist and temporary, a far cry from the Winnetka estate, the kind of place that a man rents when he is trying to become someone else or when he is trying to disappear. The divorce proceedings began with the cold, clinical efficiency of a legal transaction, which was precisely how Catherine Cavendish had always said it should be done. Emotion is expensive, her mother had told her once, with the pragmatic wisdom of a woman who had survived 2 husbands' deaths and 1 divorce and had emerged from each of them richer than she had entered. Every feeling you allow yourself is a feeling that costs you money. Learn to bill for it. Eleanor hired a shark, a woman named Diana Reeves, whose hourly rate was more than most people earned in a month, and whose reputation in the Cook County family courts was that of someone who did not lose and did not negotiate and did not feel sorry for anyone, least of all the beautiful women who came to her after their fairy tales had turned into lawsuits. Diana looked at Eleanor across the conference table with the particular kind of pity that is reserved for women who are beautiful but unmoored, who have been given everything and are now discovering that everything is not the same as having something. "What are your priorities, Mrs. Harrington?" Diana asked, pen poised over a legal pad. Eleanor sat up straighter. "Excuse me?" "In the divorce. What do you want? The house? Alimony? A settlement?" Diana's eyes were the color of steel and about as warm. "These are the questions I need answered before I can help you." It was a reasonable question. A practical question. The kind of question that Eleanor's entire adult life had been leading toward, the question of what she wanted, which she had spent 37 years avoiding in favor of focusing on what she was supposed to want, what would look good, what would read well in the society pages her mother monitored with the vigilance of a quality control inspector. And yet the answer, when it came, surprised her completely. "I want to work," she said. Diana's pen stopped moving. She looked up. "I'm sorry. I want to get a job." Diana stared at her for a long moment, and Eleanor saw in her Turner's face the same calculation that she had seen in so many faces before, the reassessment, the recalibration, the quiet judgment of a woman who had been raised for one purpose and was now, at 37, declaring that she intended to discover another. Diana had seen this before, presumably. Women like Eleanor, wealthy women who had never worked a day in their lives, who had been told that their only job was to be beautiful and available and well married, and who came to her offices after their marriages collapsed and discovered that they had no skills, no experience, no resume, and no identity outside of the one that had just been taken from them. "Mrs. Harrington," Diana said carefully, "you have no work experience. No professional degree. No, forgive me, marketable skills in the traditional sense." Eleanor heard the words and did not flinch. They were true. That was the most humiliating part. She had spent 2 decades developing herself as an ornament, a display, a beautiful object designed to enhance the aesthetic of someone else's life, and now the ornament was being asked to function as an engine, and no one, least of all herself, was confident it could. "Then I'll learn," Eleanor Eleanor said. I have the Cavendish name. I have connections. I have an eye for design that Architectural Digest has recognized twice. I am not an idiot, Diana. I am not even inexperienced. I have managed a household of 7 employees, organized events for 400 guests, maintained a social network that gave Harrington Communications its entire reputation in the Chicago market. I am not inexperienced. I am underutilized. I am a woman in a world that never expected me to be anything else. That is about to change. Diana set down her pen. She leaned back in her chair. I admire that, she said, and she sounded like she meant it, which was the most surprising thing Diana had said all morning. But let's secure the financial foundation first. The settlement negotiations are going to be contentious. Harrington Communications' legal team is already deploying delay tactics. I got word from the clerk's office this morning that they filed a motion to compel additional financial disclosures, which will push everything back by at least 3 months. And between you and me, your husband is not in a cooperative mood. Daniel doesn't want a divorce. Daniel wants to be left alone. He wants to sink into his guilt and his failure and his townhouse in Lincoln Park and not be bothered by the wreckage he's created. But he has a board to answer to, and his legal team is advising him to contest any significant settlement. They're claiming, Diana checked her notes, the particular forensic attention to detail of someone who charges $400 an hour to know exactly what the other side is claiming. They're claiming that your contributions to the marriage were primarily domestic and social in nature, and that any financial settlement should reflect that. They're building a case that you were a kept woman, Mrs. Harrington. A beautiful, expensive accessory to his life. Not a partner. Eleanor laughed. It was a short, sharp sound, utterly devoid of warmth, the kind of laugh that comes from a place of fury so pure it has gone past anger into something colder. Domestic and social. Is that what we're calling 12 years of managing a household that employed 7 people, planning events for 400 guests, maintaining a social network that gave Harrington Communications its entire reputation in the Chicago market, and being the decorative, non-threatening trophy wife that allowed Daniel to walk into every board meeting looking like a man who had his life together? Is that domestic and social? Diana smiled slowly. It was not a warm smile, but it was an approving one. If you can articulate it like that in court, Mrs. Harrington, we might not need a settlement at all. We might need a revolution. The settlement took 7 months. 7 months of depositions and financial disclosures and bitter negotiations that stripped away every remaining illusion Eleanor had about the man she had married and the world she had inhabited, every comfortable assumption about how her life was supposed to unfold. In the end, she walked away with the house, a victory that felt, in the moment, like the smallest possible triumph for the maximum possible pain, like being given the stage of a theater after the play has ended, and a settlement that was 1/3 of what Diana had initially projected, the rest swallowed by legal fees and Daniel's legal team's delaying tactics and the simple, grinding machinery of a system designed to make divorce feel like dying slowly in a room with very good lighting. She kept the house. She didn't know if it was a victory or a punishment. Maybe it was both. The house was beautiful, and it was empty, and every room was a monument to a life that no longer existed, a mausoleum dressed up in Carrara marble and designer furniture, and the particular quality of light that Eleanor had once found so comforting and now found unbearable, because it illuminated everything she had lost with the same unflinching clarity it had once used to display what she had bought she had gained. She began, tentatively, to build a new one. She started with the garden. Not the roses, those she couldn't bear to touch. They were too perfect, too tied to the memory of who she had been when she planted them, a woman who believed that beauty was a form of permanence. But the back terrace, which had been flagstone and sterile and used for exactly 3 outdoor dinners in the entire time she'd lived there. She hired a contractor from Evanston and a landscape architect, a young man named Oliver, who had studied at the Chicago Botanic Garden and had strong opinions about native plantings and pollinator corridors that Eleanor found unexpectedly thrilling. The way you might find a bird's nest thrilling when you have spent your whole life looking at paintings of birds. Together they redesigned the space into something alive. Raised beds for herbs and vegetables. A cutting garden. A fig tree in a ceramic pot that Oliver assured her would survive a Chicago winter if she moved it inside during the cold months. A promise she accepted with the faith of someone who had recently learned to believe in things she couldn't control. The work was physical. It required her to be outside, on her knees in the dirt, getting soil under her fingernails and sweat on her brow, and it was the first time in her adult life that she had done anything that left a physical trace on her body, anything that demanded something from her beyond the performance of presence. It required her to learn names, plants had names, and diseases, and requirements for sunlight and water that were as complex and specific as any human need, and learning them felt like learning a new language, one that described the world in terms she had never been taught to see. It was the first time in her adult life that she had learned anything that didn't have to do with table settings or wine pairings or the correct way to fold a napkin into a swan, and the feeling of acquiring new knowledge, real knowledge, practical knowledge, knowledge that had nothing to do with social performance, was so unfamiliar that it took her weeks to recognize it as something other than discomfort. She was, to her own astonishment, good at it. The garden responded to her attention with the wordless gratitude of living things, growing in directions she had encouraged and wilting in directions she had neglected, teaching her in the only language plants know how to speak, the language of cause and effect, of attention and consequence, of the beautiful, indifferent honesty of the natural world. The second thing she did was teach herself finance. She bought books, actual, thick, intimidating books about accounting and investment and corporate structures. Books with titles like Financial Statement Analysis and The Intelligent Investor and Corporate Finance, Theory and Practice, and she read them at the kitchen island every night, cross-referencing passages with the financial disclosures from the divorce proceedings, teaching herself to read a balance sheet the way she had once taught herself to read a fashion magazine, which is to say, obsessively, competitively, with the quiet theory of a woman who had been told all her life that she wasn't smart enough for numbers and was determined to prove otherwise. She learned the difference between assets and liabilities. She learned what a pay ratio meant and why it mattered. She learned that the financial world, which had once seemed like an impenetrable fortress of jargon and power, was actually just another language, and like all languages, it could be learned by anyone willing to put in the time. The third thing she did, the hardest, the most terrifying, the most necessary, was find a job. It took 3 months. She went through her mother's Rolodex, which was still on the antique desk in the library, leather-bound and gold-edged, a relic of a world that operated on connections and favors and the unspoken assumption that everyone was already exactly where they were supposed to be, that social position was a birthright rather than a construction. She called everyone. She smiled through the condescension of old friends who couldn't quite reconcile the Eleanor Whitmore they knew, the one with the perfect hair and the perfect house and the perfect life, with the Eleanor Whitmore who was asking, with professional urgency, if they knew of any openings, any at all, something part-time if nothing full-time, something that would let her build a resume from zero. Finally, a contact at the Chicago Alliance for the Arts, a woman named Patricia, who had been a donor in Eleanor's volunteer days and who had always treated her with a kind of genuine warmth that Eleanor had never quite trusted, offered her a position as a community outreach coordinator. The salary was modest. Modest by Cavendish standards, which were extreme, and modest by any normal human standard, which was the category Eleanor was finally, irrevocably, joining. "I'm not sure it's the right fit," Patricia said over lunch at a restaurant in River North, with the particular diplomatic care of someone who is aware they are about to insult a socialite. "Your background it's very glamorous. This is more grassroots." Eleanor looked at her across the white tablecloth and the untouched Caesar salad and the glass of sparkling water that Patricia had insisted on ordering because she didn't drink during lunch meetings, and she thought about the grass stains on her jeans from that morning, when she had been helping Oliver plant the new raised beds and had gotten so dirty that she'd had to hose off her boots before coming inside. She thought about the books on her nightstand, Baldessari's Corporate Finance, Bedley, and Brigham's Principles of Financial Management, A dog-eared paperback on non-profit budgeting that had cost her $18.99 and had done more for her education than 14 years of country club galas. She thought about the person she had been 6 months ago and the person she was becoming, and the distance between them felt like a journey she had only just begun. "Patricia," she said, "I have spent 37 years being exactly the right fit for exactly the wrong life. I'd very much like to try being the wrong fit for the right one." Patricia hired her. And in doing so, she gave Eleanor Whitmore something that no amount of money or social capital had ever given her before: a reason to be somewhere that wasn't decorative, a purpose that wasn't performance, a place in the world that she had earned rather than been given. The work was harder than anything Eleanor had ever done. Harder than the charity galas, harder than the dinner parties, harder than maintaining a 12-year marriage to a man who was secretly destroying it, because it required her to be someone she had never been trained to be, a person whose value was measured in outcomes rather than aesthetics, in results rather than impressions. Community outreach meant showing up in neighborhoods she had driven through without seeing, talking to people who had never read Architectural Digest and didn't care whether her garden had won a design award, attending meetings in church basements where the fluorescent lights buzzed and the coffee was terrible and the discussions were about things that actually mattered: affordable housing, food deserts, after-school programs for kids whose parents worked 2 jobs and still couldn't afford the summer camps that would keep those kids off the streets. She was, at first, terrible at it. She dressed wrong, too expensive, too polished, too clearly a woman who had never had to ask for anything, whose clothes were armor rather than clothing. She spoke wrong, too formal, too rehearsed, too much the cadence of a boardroom and not enough of the cadence of a community center, where people talk to each other like human beings rather than like representatives of organizations. She made assumptions that were not just wrong but offensive in their wrongness, the kind of wrong that came from a lifetime of being protected from the consequences of not knowing, from being Eleanor Cavendish, from being the kind of woman whose mistakes were expensive rather than instructive. But Eleanor had one thing that no one in that church basement had expected: she had nothing left to lose. She had already lost the biggest thing, the life she had been told was the only life worth living, and she had survived it. She had come out the other side. And what was left after the loss, after the grief and the rage and the grinding, necessary work of rebuilding herself from materials she hadn't known she possessed, was something that looked, for the first time, like freedom. She stripped herself down. She stopped wearing the couture. She bought clothes from outlet malls and wore them without apology, clothes that could get dirty and that she didn't mind if they did. She stopped talking about where she had been and started listening to where other people were, really listening, the way she had never listened before, because she had never before had anything to learn from the answers. She learned names, the names of the women who ran the food pantry, the names of the kids in the after-school program, the names of the elderly residents who came to the community center to play chess and drink bad coffee and tell stories about a Chicago that no longer existed, a city of neighborhoods and communities and human connections that the society pages never covered and that the world she had come from had never deigned to notice. She learned, for the first time in her life, what it felt like to be genuinely useful to another human being. And the feeling was so unfamiliar, so deeply outside her frame of reference, that it took her weeks to recognize it as something other than discomfort. It was not the feeling of being admired, which she had mistaken for fulfillment for most of her adult life. It was not the feeling of being provided for, which she had mistaken for love. It was the feeling of giving something that you had and that someone else needed, without expecting anything in return, and that feeling was so simple and so profound that it made everything she had previously known feel like a very elaborate lie. It was Marcus who named it for her. Marcus was a 17-year-old kid from Humboldt Park who came to the community center 3 afternoons a week to work on his college applications with a volunteer tutor, a serious, focused young man with a shaved head and an incisive, funny, intelligent, and the particular disarming directness of young people who haven't yet learned that honesty is supposed to be delivered with diplomatic padding. He was working on his personal essay, the thing that college admissions officers claim was the most important part of the application, the window into the applicant's soul, and Eleanor, who had offered to help him with it because she had nothing else to offer, had spent 3 afternoons reading his drafts and asking him questions and learning more about this boy from a neighborhood she had driven through 1,000 times without ever seeing than she had learned about most of the people in her previous life. One afternoon, after he had finished a particularly good draft, one that described, with surprising grace, what it was like to grow up as a young black man in a city that had decided, through 1,000 small choices and large policies, that his life was worth less than the lives of the people in the neighborhoods where Eleanor had grown up, he looked up from his laptop and said, "You different now." Eleanor, who had been reviewing his bibliography, looked up. "Different how? You was all stiff when you first got here. Like you was wearing a costume or something. Like you was playing a role. Now you're just, real." Eleanor sat down across from him. "Real," she repeated. "Yeah. It's cool." He returned to his laptop, but the word he had given her continued to resonate in the air between them, a gift she would spend months unwrapping. "Also, your transition sentences in the 3rd paragraph were weak. You gotta tighten those up." She went home that night and stood in her bathroom and looked at herself in the mirror, the same mirror where she had stood 7 months earlier, mascara running, life in pieces, declaring that she was not the end of who she was, and she thought about Marcus's word. Real. It was such a small word. Such an ordinary word. And yet it described something that Eleanor Cavendish Whitmore had spent 37 years avoiding with every breath in her body, every choice she had made, every assumption she had accepted without questioning. She had not been real. She had been a composition, a carefully curated presentation of the most attractive possible surface, designed to impress and to protect and to perform a version of humanity that bore no relationship to anything she actually felt or wanted or feared. And she had been that way not because she was dishonest, but because she had been raised in a world that rewarded surfaces and punished depth, that taught women like her to be beautiful first and everything else second, and that had set her up, beautifully, catastrophically, for a life that could not survive the first furious challenge. The challenge had come, and she was still here. And she was beginning, just beginning, to suspect that the woman who had survived it might be someone she actually wanted to know. The divorce was finalized on a gray April morning, the kind of tentative, half-hearted spring day that Chicago specializes in, crocuses pushing up through the last of the snow, a sky the color of old pewter, a wind that promised warmth but delivered only the memory of it. Eleanor wore a navy dress, simple, modest, from a department store in Highland Park, and she sat in a courtroom in the Cook County Courthouse and listened to a judge she had never met read aloud the legal dissolution of her marriage with the same bored cadence he probably used for parking tickets and small claims disputes. She did not cry. She did not feel the dramatic, operatic grief that she might once have expected, the kind of grief that movies had taught her to associate with endings like this. What she felt was smaller, quieter, stranger, something like the feeling you get when you step off a roller coaster and your legs are still convinced the world is moving even though it has stopped, the residual vertigo of a body that has been through something it hasn't fully processed yet. Something like relief. Something like the first breath after you've been holding your breath for a very long time. Daniel was not there. He had sent his attorney, a younger man with wire-rimmed glasses and nervous energy. She was grateful. She did not want to see the man who had made her believe in fairy tale and then prove they were built on sand. She drove home through the city, past the Gold Coast where they had met, past the peninsula where they had married, past the streets of her old life like a tourist in a country she had been exiled from, seeing everything with the clarity of someone who no longer belongs to it. When she got to the house, she didn't go inside immediately. She sat in the Tesla, her Tesla now, the one Daniel had bought when he sold the Porsches, which she had refused to let him take because it was the one thing in the divorce that felt neutral, a machine with no memories attached, and she looked at the garden through the windshield. The fig tree was on the back terrace, right where Oliver had placed it, a living thing that had survived its first Chicago winter and was leasing out with the optimism of plants in spring. The raised beds were green with new growth, chives and mint and the first leaves of the tomato plants she had started from seed on her kitchen counter, proof that she was capable of creating life rather than just arranging objects. The cutting garden was beginning to show the first shoots of something that might, by June, be beautiful. She got out of the car. She walked to the garden. She knelt on the wet earth and pressed her fingers into the soil, the actual dirt, not the manicured, pruned, landscape architect-designed dirt of her old life, but the real, cold, honest dirt of a garden that she was building from scratch, and she felt, for the first time in a year, something that she could only describe as peace. It was not happiness. Happiness was still too large a word, too clean a concept for the complicated, tender, sometimes anguished tangle of feelings she was navigating. It was something more provisional and more durable, the feeling of a foundation being laid, of a structure taking shape beneath her that was hers alone, that had nothing to do with the Cavendish name or the Harrington money or the glossy, empty life she had mistaken for a destiny. It was the feeling of having survived something that should have destroyed her and having emerged, on the other side, as someone who was still learning how to breathe but was no longer afraid of the air. She was 38 years old. She was starting over. She was terrified and exhilarated and fundamentally uncertain about every single thing in her future, and the uncertainty felt, for the first time, like freedom. She had spent her whole life knowing exactly what came next, the next board meeting, the next dinner party, the next social obligation. Now nothing was planned. Everything was possible. And the vertigo of that was the most alive she had felt in years. Her phone buzzed. A text from Oliver, "The Nepeta is coming in. You should see it." She smiled. She stood up, brushed the dirt from her knees, and walked inside to change into her gardening clothes, old jeans, a cotton shirt, boots that she didn't mind getting muddy, and went back outside to see the Nepeta, the tough, self-seeding, determinedly persistent plant she had put in the ground in the first wild weeks of her grief, when she had needed something alive and uncomplicated to tend to while she figured out how to tend to herself. The months that followed were the most alive Eleanor had ever felt. She threw herself into work with a ferocity that surprised even her. The Chicago Alliance for the Arts was running a fundraising campaign for a new community arts center in Pilton, a neighborhood most of Chicago's elite had never visited, and Eleanor, who had spent 2 decades planning galas for causes she cared nothing about, discovered that when she actually cared about something, she was not just competent. She was extraordinary. She organized a benefit concert at the Chicago Cultural Center, working with a local musicians collective to program an evening of music by Chicago composers that had never been performed publicly before. She recruited artists she had met through the community network, painters and sculptors and ceramicists and installation artists who worked in Pilton and who had been making beautiful things in obscurity for years, whose work deserved to be seen and whose communities deserved the dignity of recognition. She wrote copy, actual, published copy, in the campaign's marketing material and in the program notes for the concert, and when Patricia read the first draft, she looked up from her desk with an expression of genuine surprise. "Eleanor," she said, "this is beautiful. This is exactly what we needed. Where did you learn to write like this?" Eleanor, who had spent her entire life being praised for things she had purchased rather than created, felt something shift in her chest. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I just wrote what I felt." "That's the secret," Patricia said. "That's always been the secret." It was a small victory. It was also a turning point. For the first time in her adult life, Eleanor had created something, not decorated, arranged, curated, or approved something, but actually created something, from her own mind and her own hard-won understanding of the world, something that was genuinely, undeniably hers. Something that existed because she had made it exist. She kept writing. She started a blog, nothing public, just a private document where she wrote about her experiences at the community center, about Marcus and his college essays and the particular satisfaction of watching a 17-year-old figure out how to describe his own life in language that made other people care about it, about the women at the food pantry and the elderly chess players and the small, daily acts of grace that she witnessed in a church basement on the west side that she would never have known existed if her life hadn't fallen apart and forced her to rebuild it on different ground. She did not write about Daniel. She did not write about the marriage, or the betrayal, or the slow, grinding reconstruction of a self that had been built on foundations of sand. She wrote about what was in front of her, the present tense, the actual world, the people and plants and problems that made up the raw material of a life that was finally, irreversibly, her own. And the act of writing, of putting words to the things she saw and felt and thought, began to feel less like a record and more like a discovery, like she was finding things out about herself by describing them, learning who she was by naming who she was becoming. She started seeing someone. Not seriously, not yet, maybe not ever, but genuinely, with an open heart and an amused, cautious intelligence she hadn't known she possessed. His name was James. He was a carpenter hired to build shelving for the community center, 52, divorced, a widower whose wife had died of breast cancer 6 years ago, with hands permanently marked by years of work and a dry humor that made Eleanor laugh in ways she had forgotten were possible. He was not handsome the way Daniel had been, not a golden boy, not someone whose appearance announced his own privilege. He was handsome the way a well-made table is handsome, the way a life lived at the intersection of effort and result is handsome. They went to dinner at a Thai restaurant in Evanston, sitting in a booth with cracked vinyl seats and menus that were laminated and slightly sticky, and they talked, really talked, the way she had never talked to Daniel. James told her about his wife, about the 6 years he had spent learning to be alone, about the particular loneliness of a widower in a world that doesn't quite know what to do with grief that doesn't fit the expected narrative. Eleanor told him about the marriage, not in death but in something equally final. The death of a dream. The death of a version of herself she had believed was permanent. "I keep thinking I should have known," she said one evening, sitting on a bench near the Evanston landfill, not a romantic location, but one that James had suggested because he was helping to build a community garden on the site and was absurdly, endearingly passionate about the project. Should have seen the signs. But I was so busy being the wife I was supposed to be that I never stopped to ask if I was actually happy. I mean, I was comfortable. I was provided for. But happy? She shook her head. I don't think I ever really let myself ask that question. Why not? She thought about it. Because the answer might have been no. And if the answer was no, then I would have had to do something about it. And doing something about it would have meant admitting that everything I'd been raised to want wasn't actually what I wanted. And that would have meant, she paused. It would have meant admitting that I didn't know who I was. And I think I was afraid of that more than anything. James was quiet for a moment. Then he reached over and took her hand, and his hand was rough and warm and real in a way that made her throat tighten. "Eleanor," he said, "you just told me who you are. You just spent 10 minutes describing exactly who you are. The fact that it took a catastrophe to get here doesn't make it less real." She looked at him. The late light caught the silver in his hair and the lines around his eyes and the particular quality of attention that he brought to every conversation, as if what she was saying was the most important thing he had ever heard. "How do you do that?" she asked. "Do what?" "Make everything sound simple." He laughed. "It's a gift. Also a curse. My ex-wife used to say I was constitutionally incapable of complexity." He squeezed her hand. "But Eleanor, I mean this, the woman sitting next to me right now? She's not the woman who married Daniel Harrington. She's someone a lot more interesting. And a lot more fun at parties, honestly." She laughed. She actually laughed, a real laugh, not the practiced, social laugh she had deployed at 1,000 galas, but a laugh that came from somewhere in her belly and made her eyes water and her shoulders shake. It was the most honest sound she had made in years, and it felt like proof of something she had been trying to believe, that she was still capable of joy. She got a call from Daniel on a warm evening in July. She almost didn't answer it. She was in the garden, watching the sun set over the terrace Oliver had built, a glass of rose in her hand and a new book on urban agriculture open on her lap, a book she had requested from the library because she was thinking about expanding the garden, adding a small greenhouse, maybe even trying her hand at growing food year-round. The phone buzzed insistently on the outdoor table. She looked at the screen. His name. His number. The first time he had called her in 5 months. She answered. Eleanor. His voice was different. She couldn't identify exactly how, something in the texture of it, the weight of it. Less defended. More human. The voice of a man who had been through something and was still figuring out what it meant. I'm sorry to call out of the blue. It's fine. It wasn't entirely fine. But it was not the catastrophe it would have been a year ago. I got your email. About the campaign. The Pilsen Arts Center. She had sent a mass email to everyone in her contacts, old friends, former colleagues, the scattered wreckage of her social network, asking for donations to the Community Arts Center. It had been Patricia's idea, a standard fundraising tactic, and Eleanor had sent it with the same mix of hope and embarrassment she felt whenever she had to ask anyone for anything. She hadn't expected Daniel to respond. She certainly hadn't expected him to call. I donated, he said. Anonymously. Through the Alliance's website. I didn't want it to be about me. Eleanor closed her book. She sat up straighter on the outdoor sofa. That's generous of you, Daniel. It's not generous. He paused. She heard him breathing, the way people breathe when they are about to say something difficult, when the words are there but the courage to release them is still building. I owe you more than money can repay. You know that. I destroyed something beautiful because I didn't have the courage to face my own failure. I looked at my life falling apart, and instead of turning to you, the one person who would have stood by me, I went out and hired strangers to make me feel like a man again. And I have spent every day since then knowing exactly how badly I failed. Eleanor said nothing. She watched the last light drain from the sky, turning the garden from gold to gray, the roses going from illuminated to shadowed in the space of a breath. I want you to know that I'm getting help. Actual help. A therapist. Meetings, I don't know if you know what that means, but I've been going to meetings. For men. For men like me. Men who, he stopped. I've been working on myself, Eleanor. I can't undo what I did. But I can try to make sure I never do it again. Daniel. I'm not asking for another chance. I'm not that delusional. I'm not even sure I'd deserve one if you were offering. I wanted you to know that I see it now. I see what I did. And I'm sorry. I'm genuinely, deeply sorry. The silence stretched between them, a continent of silence. 12 years of marriage compressed into the space between two people who had once shared a bed and now shared only this, an ocean of regret and the last light of a July evening and the sound of a garden that Eleanor had built with her own hands coming into its fullness around her. I appreciate the call, Eleanor said finally. And I appreciate the donation. And I forgive you, Daniel. I want you to know that. I genuinely do. But I'm not the woman you married. I don't know who she was anymore. And I don't think I want to find out. I understand. Good. She hung up. She sat there in the garden as the first stars appeared, and she did not cry, because she was done crying over that particular loss, the loss of the dream of the golden life, the dream of being loved perfectly by a perfect man in a perfect house, the dream that her mother had sold her and that she had purchased without reading the contract. That dream was over. It had been over for a long time. And in its place, something quieter and sturdier was growing, something that looked less like a fairy tale and more like a life. A week later, Marcus graduated from high school. Eleanor sat in the gymnasium of the public school in Humboldt Park, folding chairs, exposed pipes, the particular institutional beige of every public building in America, and watched this boy she had known for 2 years walk across the stage to receive his diploma, and she thought, this is what it looks like. This is what it feels like to be part of something real. Something that existed outside the economy of wealth and status and social capital that had defined her entire existence. Something that was real in the way that effort and achievement in community were real, in the way that a young man's future opening up before him was real. After the ceremony, Marcus found her in the crowd. He was wearing a suit that was slightly too big for him, the way boy suits always are in photographs that parents will treasure forever, and he had a smile on his face that was so wide and so genuine that it made her chest ache. "I got in," he said. "Got in where?" "University of Illinois. Full ride. STEM program." He said it the way he said everything, casually, with a shrug that was designed to conceal the magnitude of what he had just accomplished. "Your transition sentences were clutch, by the way. Really helped with the personal statement. That thing about my grandmother's garden?" Everyone cried. Eleanor hugged him. She hugged him hard, and she didn't care who was watching, and she didn't care that she was wearing a cashmere sweater that cost more than his suit. She held this boy who had called her real, who had taught her more about resilience and humor and the irreducible value of honesty than any book or therapist or divorce proceeding ever had, and she said into his shoulder, "I am so proud of you, Marcus. So goddamn proud." He pulled back, grinning. "Language, Mrs. H." She laughed. "Go celebrate. You deserve it." He disappeared into the crowd of families and friends and communities that had produced this extraordinary young man, and Eleanor stood alone in the gymnasium that smelled like floor wax and teenage hope, and she felt something shift inside her. Not a collapse. Not a breaking. Something building. Something rising, like the first green shoots of a cutting garden in March, tentative, stubborn, impossibly alive. The Arts Center opened in October. The Pilton community came out in force, families, artists, neighbors, the entire ecosystem of a neighborhood that had fought for something beautiful in a city that had written it off. The building was modest by architectural standards but extraordinary by the standards of the people who would use it, a black box theater, a ceramic studio with wheels and kilns, a gallery space, an after-school wing with computers and tutoring rooms and a garden in the courtyard that reminded Eleanor, achingly, of her own. She gave a speech. She hadn't planned to. Patricia had suggested it, gently, diplomatically, in the way that Patricia did everything, as a gentle push in a direction she hoped Eleanor would go rather than a direct command. But when Eleanor stood at the podium in front of 300 people and looked out at the crowd, the words that came out were not the polished, rehearsed remarks she had prepared. They were something else. Something true. "I want to tell you a story," she began, and then she told them. Not all of it. Not the divorce or the escorts or the nights she had spent crying on the bathroom floor. Not the particular humiliation of discovering that the man she trusted had been paying strangers for the intimacy she would have given him freely if he had only acted. But enough. The part about growing up believing that her worth was determined by the quality of what surrounded her. The part about discovering, the hard way, that the life she had been given was not the life she was meant to live. The part about finding, in a church basement on the west side, in the company of people who had far less and knew far more about resilience than she ever would, a version of herself that she actually wanted to be. "I'm not going to stand here and tell you that hardship is a gift," she said, and there was a ripple of quiet laughter, because the crowd was smart and knew the cliches and were tired of being told that suffering was good for them. "It isn't. It's just hard. But I will say this, the hardest thing that ever happened to me was the door that opened the rest of my life. And I am standing here today in a building that represents everything I now believe in: community, creativity, the absolute conviction that every single person in this room deserves access to beauty and opportunity and a place where they can become who they are meant to be." She paused. She looked out at the faces, young and old, tired and bright-eyed, skeptical and hopeful, the whole mosaic of human beings who had shown up for something they believed in, who had fought for this building through sheer stubbornness. "Thank you for letting me be part of this," she said. "I will spend the rest of my life trying to deserve it." The applause was loud and warm and genuine, and Eleanor stepped back from the podium, and Patricia squeezed her arm, and the evening light was streaming through the gallery windows, and for the first time in a very long time, Eleanor Whitmore felt exactly where she was supposed to be, a woman who had finally stopped performing and started living. She went home that night to the house in Winnetka, legally and financially hers, by a settlement that had cost her years and every illusion she had held about love and marriage and the reliability of happiness. The garden was dark, but she could see the shapes of it, the raised beds, the fig tree, the cutting garden that was still blooming in October's unseasonably warm weather, the last gasp of a season that didn't want to end. She put on her coat and went outside. She knelt in the dirt, even though the ground was cold, and she pressed her fingers into the soil one more time before the winter came and locked the garden into its annual sleep. She thought about the woman she had been, the one in the cashmere robe, standing at the base of the curved staircase, believing that beauty was armor and money was love. That woman was gone, erased by grief and the grinding work of rebuilding herself from materials she hadn't known she possessed. She thought about the woman she was becoming. She didn't have a clear picture yet. Still uncertain, still learning, still afraid more often than she would admit. But she was building something, out of community outreach and fundraising campaigns and late nights with finance textbooks and early mornings with Oliver in the garden, and the extraordinary discovery that she was capable of more than she had ever been allowed to believe. She stood up. She brushed the dirt from her knees. She looked up at the house, its tall windows dark against the autumn sky, its elegant facade still beautiful even though the woman inside it was no longer the woman it was built for. She had loved this house once, the way you love anything that represents the life you thought you were supposed to live. But she didn't love it now. She was not sure what she felt about it. It was a structure. It was shelter. It was the place where she was learning to become someone new, and that was enough. She was going to sell it. She had known that for months. The house was too large for one person, too expensive to maintain, too saturated with the past, every room a memory, every surface a history, every morning a small confrontation with the self she was trying to leave behind. She was going to sell it and buy something smaller, an apartment in the city, maybe, or a cottage somewhere with a garden she could actually manage without a staff, something that was hers in a way this house had never been, something that fit the life she was building instead of the life she had left behind. She took one last look at the garden. The nepeta was still blooming, that soft, grayish purple she had planted in the first wild weeks of her grief, when she had needed something alive and uncomplicated to tend to while she figured out how to tend to herself. It had survived the winter. It had survived the summer. It was still there, still blooming, stubbornly beautiful in the way that survival is beautiful, that persistence is beautiful, that the refusal to stop trying is beautiful. She smiled. She went inside. She locked the door behind her and walked through the empty house, past the library, past the dining room, past the kitchen where she had once sat across from her husband and learned that the life she had was not the life she wanted, and she climbed the stairs to the master bedroom, where she sat in the window seat with a notebook and a pen, and she began to write. Not a diary. Not a journal. Something else. Something she had been thinking about for weeks, maybe longer, a book. A real book about a woman who had everything and lost it and found something better. Not a memoir, exactly, she was not ready to write about that yet, was not sure she ever would be. Not fiction either, she did not have the imagination for it, had been trained to curry other people's visions rather than generate her own. Something in between. Something true. Something that had been waiting inside her all along, patient as seeds in winter. She wrote until the sun came up. She wrote about the garden and the courtroom and the church basement and Marcus and James and the fig tree that had survived its first Chicago winter in a ceramic pot, that had leaped out in spring with the optimism of plants that do not know they are supposed to die. She wrote about the night she found the photographs on Daniel's phone, and the morning she stood in the bathroom mirror and declared that she was not the end of who she was, even though she had felt, in that moment, like nothing could ever prove it. She wrote about the slow, painful, extraordinary process of discovering that the most valuable thing she had was not her face or her name or her house, but her capacity, her stubborn, resilient, finally awakened capacity to build something that mattered. She was not writing to be published. She was not writing to be read. She was writing because it was the first time in her adult life that she had something to say that came entirely from her, unprompted, unedited, unrehearsed, and the feeling of having a voice, a real voice, an authentic voice, was so intoxicating and so unfamiliar that she could not stop. It was like the feeling she had when she first put her hands in the dirt and planted something, the feeling of creation rather than curation, of making rather than buying, of being a source rather than a surface. The sun came up over Winnetka, and the light fell through the window, and Eleanor Whitmore sat at the desk in her bedroom with a pen in her hand and a like she was finally proud of spread out before her, and she kept writing. Outside, the Nepeta bloomed. The garden slept. The city of Chicago woke around her, ordinary and extraordinary, full of people who were struggling and surviving and finding, in the most unlikely places, the quiet, stubborn grace of a second chance. And Eleanor, who had been raised to be beautiful, trained to be a wife, told all her life that her only value was in what she could display, given everything and lost it all and found something she had never known she was looking for, rode her way into a future that no one had described to her, least of all herself, and it was messy and imperfect and full of doubt, and it was the most honest thing she had ever done. She had everything money could buy. And then money couldn't buy it anymore. And then she discovered, slowly, painfully, that she had everything she actually needed. And it had nothing to do with the house, or the name, or the life she had been assigned. It had everything to do with the woman she had fought to become. She was 38 years old. She was just getting started. And for the very first time in her entire life, she couldn't wait to find out who she might become tomorrow, next year, in all the years ahead.